The Mishnah is, as I mentioned, a major text in the Jewish intellectual tradition. And perhaps one of the most important reasons that this text is so different from so many others is the fact that it made Judaism portable. It made it diaspora ready. It is a massive text that allowed Judaism to leave the narrow confines of the polity of the region of Israel, and specifically leave the temple itself, and exist effectively as a viable entity outside the land of Israel in the increasingly far-flung diaspora that Jews found themselves in. The Mishnah was kind of like a portable tabernacle. It was a portable religion, something that could be taken with them wherever they went, and could serve as the fertile soil for the development of Judaism in many other climates. It takes Judaism out of a physical structure and puts it into an intellectual, textual structure, and later this becomes the foundation of the Talmud, which really takes it even to a further level, and we'll talk about that in a later lecture. So our discussion today is going to be based on the Mishnah itself. We're going to, because we're not talking about a historical span of time, we're talking about a text that situates within history. That's really the main source for it. However, as we shall see later, there are a lot of really useful extra Mishnaic texts that were considered and yet rejected for inclusion in the Mishnah by Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, and those texts were preserved in other bodies of information which we have to this day. So the Mishnah has kind of like a second edition that's not considered as valid as the Mishnah itself, as we shall see shortly. That's useful for understanding the Mishnah and the Talmud as well. We also have, to a lesser degree, some sources from non-Jewish origins, such as Roman and Persian documents, that reflect on the Mishnah and give us a sense of what that text really means as a whole. Okay, let's recap, though, the historical background so we can place this text in its appropriate context. The temple was destroyed in the late 1st century, and the Jews essentially lost their sovereignty. Roman imposition of more tightened restrictions on Jewish activity, the development of more and more fractious movements within Judaism, in particular the birth of Christianity, began to fragment the Jewish population, already suffering a devastating body blow from the destruction of the temple. There was an attempt to regain Jewish sovereignty of some sort, or at least self-government in the land of Israel under Bar Kokhba in the early part of the 2nd century, and that unfortunately failed, and there was a tremendous amount of persecution under the Emperor Hadrian. So by the time you get to the late 2nd century, things look terrible for the Jews. They've lost their temple, they've lost any kind of self-government, their leadership is increasingly persecuted, they're being scattered throughout the ancient Near East. I mean, things look really bad. How is it possible that the Jews could survive such a tremendous threat to their identity? Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi was the answer to this difficulty. According to Talmudic legend, he was born on the day that Rabbi Akiva died. Rabbi Akiva, of course, one of the most famous rabbis of the ancient period, killed through Hadrianic persecution as one of the so-called 10 martyrs of the state. In Hebrew, the Asara Haruge Malchus, that are commemorated in the High Holiday service. He had a political position because the Jews did have a very tenuous kind of at least titular leadership that was grudgingly recognized by the Romans. He was the Nasi, known as the prince, and he held a certain degree of political authority over the Jews. He shared much of that authority with the Av Beit Din. That is something for a much larger discussion, but think of, for example, Hillel and Shammai. If you're familiar with rabbinic texts, Hillel was the Nasi and Shammai was the Av Beit Din. He was known, Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, was known for his very close relationship with a mysterious Roman leader known as Antoninus in the Talmud, where the Talmud records all kinds of long-winded and complex discussions of theology that they had really quite profound and fascinating aspects of dialogue between the Roman and the Jewish world, which represents two things. First of all, it represents the engagement of Judaism with a much larger population, but at the same time it also represented a pragmatis modus vivendi, because a close relationship with the Romans was essential for Yehuda HaNasi to maintain his authority over the Jews and to wield that power effectively to maintain the integrity of the Jewish people. It's possible that this Antoninus was even Marcus Aurelius, the famous emperor of Rome, who was known as the kind of philosopher king of the period, although his dates are just a little bit early to really jive with Yehuda HaNasi well. It could have been one of his successors, perhaps modeled after Marcus Aurelius, but nevertheless the idea is that Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi had close ties with the Roman government and was able to gently negotiate the difficulties of maintaining Jewish existence under these trying conditions. So let's look at the Mishnah itself. Let's try to understand some of the background of it. First of all, the Mishnah is a crucial text in what is known as the Oral Torah. According to traditional rabbinic theology, which has come down as the basis of modern Orthodox theology today, for example, the Torah was given to Moses in two distinct forms. The first was the written Torah, which is expressed in the first 5 books of Moses, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Scriptures: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. But alongside this written Torah was a massive body of information known as the Oral Torah, so called because it was not conveyed in a written fashion. It was conveyed only as oral teachings from God to Moses, from Moses then to Joshua, and so on and so forth, all the way through the generations. Now, this Oral Torah, we do have several references to a body of knowledge circulating in the ancient world, but we have no written examples of it until we get to the 2nd century, when several rabbis, not only Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, but also Rabbi Meir, for example, began to keep small personal notebooks of the Oral Torah, which they would share with their students. The Oral Torah has a very important role to play in that the written Torah is difficult to understand. It has a lot of opaque moments in it, and it has a lot of passages where, you know, if you're reading it as a totally secular document, say, well, this is, for example, a spelling error, or why would you say it in this way? Or, for example, why are these letters printed upside down? And there are such things in the written Torah. The Oral Torah is the very important complement to the written Torah, and it is the interpretive tradition through which the written Torah is understood. This is perhaps one of the most significant what's the word for when you crossroads. This is one of those specific crossroads where Christianity goes one way and Judaism goes another way. Judaism clearly follows the very strong influence of the Oral Torah, whereas Christianity essentially leaves behind the Oral Torah, to some degree creates its own Oral Torah. That takes us far beyond the scope of our discussion today. But that's one of the crucial elements of traditional rabbinic theology, the idea that there are 2 Torahs, the written and the oral. What exactly is in this Oral Torah? Well, there are 3 basic expressions of it. The first is exegetical, meaning deriving the essential meaning of these often opaque passages in the Torah. This is known in Hebrew as midrash. And midrash takes itself 2 forms. Sometimes it is halachic midrash, meaning it is an explanation of the text that clarifies a law. And sometimes it is agadic midrash, which means legendary midrash, where it teaches some kind of ethical, moral, philosophical lesson built into the text, not necessarily one that commands specific legislation, but one that speaks to a larger topic of how a Jew should behave. Secondly, the Oral Torah is expressed in the esoteric, meaning the mystical. And this is, of course, the long Kabbalistic tradition, which will be the subject of a lecture later on in this course, but it doesn't find written expression until really quite a bit later. Midrash also doesn't find a lot. Well, no, I shouldn't. I'll take that back. Finally, the legal expression of the Oral Torah is what we're going to be focusing on today. That is the Midrash, meaning, okay, we have this wonderful document, the Chumash, the 5 books of Moses. How are we supposed to behave? How are we supposed to interpret this document so that we know how a Jew should live his or her life? So the legal functions of the oral Torah, which are explained at great length, or at least discussed at great length in the Midrash, are threefold in nature. The first is the oral Torah clarifies ambiguities. For example, the Torah says that on the holiday of Sukkot, one should gather 4 types of plant life, the so-called arba minim, known as the lulav and esrog, for example, and you're supposed to wave them in various patterns. Now, in terms of the description of those 4 types of plants, it describes the palm frond and the myrtle and the I forget what the other one is called. It's the aravot in Hebrew. And then it says, the last one, it says the pri-eitz hadar, the fruit of a goodly tree. So what does that mean? It's ambiguous. Does that mean, for example, an orange, which are delicious down here in Florida? A grapefruit? I mean, if you were to walk into synagogue with a grapefruit, I think you would, be laughed at for the rest of the year. In fact, the oral Torah clarifies when it says pri-eitz hadar, it's referring specifically to a citrus fruit known as the etrog, which is shown here on the slide, a little kind of greenish, sometimes yellow fruit. Secondly, the oral Torah supplies omissions in the text. The Torah, for example, says that in the Shema prayer that Jews are to place these words as a sign upon their hands and as frontlets, that's how totafot is usually translated, frontlets between their eyes. So what exactly does that mean? Are we supposed to take that, metaphorically? Is it a real term? That's obviously not Jewish practice. Jewish practice explains that when it says a sign upon your hand and as frontlets between your eyes, it refers to these complex leather and parchment devices that are placed on the head and forearm, as you see the picture of the young man there wearing these tefillin. The Torah itself doesn't say anything about how tefillin should be constructed. It is only in the oral Torah that we have such thing. And finally, the written Torah often is prone to simplistic misreadings. For example, when it says ayin tachas ayin, an eye for an eye, the oral Torah is quite vociferous in maintaining that that does not mean that if Reuven knocks out Shimon's eye, the just punishment for Reuven would be to have Shimon knock out his eye. What it means is that the monetary value of Shimon's eye should be calculated, and Reuven will be required to pay that money to Shimon. So these 3 basic functions, clarifying ambiguities, supplying omissions, and contradicting simplistic misreadings of the text, are really what the oral Torah is all about, at least the Mishnah as part of the oral Torah. So when Rabbi Yehuda Nasi sat down to write the oral Torah, as it were, there was a tremendous amount of controversy, and that controversy lasted for a couple of centuries, because the fact is, if it's been oral for so long, it represents a huge break in tradition to commit it to writing, and there was tremendous hesitancy to do so. However, he was very mindful of the tremendously dire situation that the Jews found themselves in, with phenomenal political and social pressures as a result of the Roman persecution and the dispersion of the Jews and the economic realities of Jewish life at the time. And so therefore he instituted this very bold plan to gather rabbis from all around and to collect all of the oral teachings that they had received. He collected them assiduously and wrote them down, and then he took all of these texts and he organized them into a form which he called the Mishnah. The term itself, Mishnah, comes from the word lishanen, which means to teach. It is the teaching. Now, when you can get all these rabbis together in one place and they're all saying over their teachings, as you might expect, particularly when you're dealing with an orally transmitted amount of information, there will be some inconsistencies. And there were a tremendous number of inconsistencies. So Rabbi Yehuda Nasi's genius in this particular area was to go through all of these texts and to filter out those that he felt were somehow defective. Not inauthentic, but perhaps not the best way that a subject could be stated, or perhaps misleading, or perhaps fragmentary. And so what he did was he kept the best texts and he placed those in the Mishnah, and the texts that really did not fit, they were set aside and they were incorporated later into texts we know as the Tosefta and the Baraitot, and these things become very, very important when we go to the Talmud later on in this course. So let's look at the structure of the Mishnah, understand what it's all about. He divided it into 6 distinct areas of human activity. The first is known as Zraim, or seeds, and this is basically a huge compendium of law dealing with agriculture. Things such as the sabbatical year, that the idea that the land of Israel has to lie fallow 1 year in 7, the prohibition against mixing crops together, and the laws of blessings, because all of these foods that come out of the ground later, sustain us, and therefore the most important tractate perhaps is the first one, Brachot, which deals with blessings. The second section is Moed, which deals with times, which deals with essentially the holidays, Shabbat, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, things like that. The third section, and the largest actually, is Nashim. Well, actually, I take that back. I think actually Tahara is probably larger, but let's go on. Nashim, or women, is probably better stated as relations with women, because the Mishnah is a tremendously androcentric document, meaning it is written by men for men. And when it deals with women, it's really all about how to relate to women. That's why it's one of the most mysterious topics of the Mishnah. That's a joke, okay? But what it deals with, for example, is marriage, divorce, levirate marriage, the concept that a man who unfortunately dies childless, his widow marries his brother, things like this. Those are all dealt with in the tractate known as Nashim. The fourth section is Nazikin, or damages. Nashim and Nazikin are perhaps the most studied sections of the Mishnah, and especially the Talmud, upon which the Talmud is really essentially an extended commentary of the Mishnah, as we'll discuss in next week's lecture. Nazikin, it deals with damages like torts, civil law, criminal law, things like this. Reuven's cow eats the grass in Shimon's porch, and Shimon's porch falls in, and Reuven's cow or goat breaks its leg. How do you sort those things out? That's all in Nazikin. The last 2 sections are not as well studied. Kodshim deals with essentially the temple rituals, holy things, and Taharot deals with the complex laws of maintaining ritual purity for several of the functions involved in the temple in particular. So that's basically the content of the Mishnah. It forms an acronym in Aramaic, Zman Nakat, which means time flies, or time is taken, which is an easy way to remember all 6 of these. Now, one of the most fascinating aspects of Mishnaic debate is the fact that since it involves the opinion of so many rabbis, it is quite intentionally ambiguous in nature, meaning Rabbi Yehuda Nasi rarely clarified, what is the bottom line. A typical Mishnah will read, Rabbi X says that this kind of chicken is kosher. Rabbi Y will say this kind of chicken is not kosher. And that's the end of it. Then you'll go on to something else. And so here you are, if you're trying to read a law book, a law code, you're saying, well, which one is it? Do we accept the opinion of Rabbi X, or do we accept the opinion of Rabbi Y? The Mishnah rarely says what Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi feels is the correct text. And so as a general norm, rejected opinions are cited in this text. This is something which is really quite fascinating and speaks to the root of Jewish culture, because in the very, very foundation of this important document, debate is essential. The only way you can really engage this text properly is by arguing about, okay, well, what are the grounds for Rabbi X's opinion? What are the grounds for Rabbi Y's opinion? Perhaps Rabbi Y was speaking out of a particular circumstance. Perhaps Rabbi X was speaking under the assumption that certain factors were pertaining to the situation or to the chicken, and so on. So it means that the only way you can really learn Mishnah properly is through dialogue, which is later expressed in commentary. That's essentially what the Talmud is going to be, as we'll speak about next week. The Mishnah also is not a typical law code in that a lot of non-legal material is also included within it. Most famous perhaps is the tractate known as Pirkei Avot, the chapters of the fathers, which is an absolutely brilliant and soaring discussion of Jewish philosophy and ethics, which is ritually studied every year as an incredible, basis for Jewish thought and morality. So, in conclusion, the Mishnah is a work of subtle genius. The fact that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi left it so open-ended and left it rather unfinished in nature meant that the only way that Jews could deal with this is through being involved. It's not a kind of text where you can read it once and understand what's going on. Every passage has to be puzzled over, and perhaps more importantly, every passage should be debated, which requires an interlocutor. It requires someone else. It requires a chavrusa, a study partner, to engage in the text together. This formed the basis of Jewish study, requiring Jews to live closer together and to be attracted to people who were able to explicate this complex document. And in a way, this book was essential to preserving both the oral quality of the oral Torah, because it required that active human interface, and it also preserved the vitality of the Jewish people and allowed them to keep their Judaism even under the trying circumstances of the diaspora. So that's about it. I hope you enjoyed this lecture, and I look forward to speaking with you on the next topic.